This program, the original 1787 Electoral College and Alternatives, was presented by Richard A. Matheson on March 24th, 2019, to the Breakfast Forum of the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Lehigh Valley.
And this morning, we have Richard Matheson as our presenter, and he'll be talking about the pros and cons of the Electoral College.
Actually, I've changed the title to the Electoral College and Alternatives. And that was because when Frank introduced it 2 weeks ago, he gagged on the word pros. So he made clear his opinion. But yeah, the Electoral College and Alternatives. Welcome. Right. Welcome to the Electoral College and Alternatives. And that's me. And that's Independence Hall in Philadelphia, where in 1787, 55 framers got together and produced the Constitution. This is the Constitutional Convention. And that's the Constitution. And the Constitution is one of the great documents of human freedom, and with the first 10 amendments, it's the greatest document of freedom in the history of the world, I would say. But it contains a clumsy and strange method of electing the president called the Electoral College. And the Electoral College method is controversial. In fact, it just hit the news this past week when a presidential candidate, Elizabeth Warren, talked about getting rid of it, and everybody chimed in and said, "Me too." So that means we did perfect scheduling for today. It was supposed to have been last week, and we wouldn't have had it in the news quite the same way. So the Electoral College, what we're going to be doing today is trying to understand what the framers were trying to do, and then look at the ways to change it. Because the framers were brilliant, so they deserve to be understood, or so I would claim. And they also were wrong about several things. One of them is they thought slavery would decline, which turned out to not be true, unfortunately. And they were not aware at all of a two-party system, which in fact is what has developed. So we're also going to be discussing changing, and changing to most people means changing to direct election, a popular vote. And there's two ways to do that. One is by amending the Constitution, and the other is there's other methods that are working right now, including one that has brand new, important news as recently as 9 days ago, March 15th. So that's what our topics are. Direct election, which is using a popular vote, treats the country as one unit, 50 states and DC. And I'm going to assume a two-party system just to get the two concepts up there. And so you add each candidate's total vote and the winner gets declared. It seems simple, not always as simple as it seems when you get third or fourth parties involved. But the Electoral College treats the country as 51 voting units, 50 states and DC. Each state gets one electoral vote for each House and Senate member. And that means there's 538 electoral votes, 435 House members, that's automatic, and 100 Senate. And 3 votes given to DC, District of Columbia. And each state determines its own procedure for allocating those votes. And 48 states use a winner-take-all procedure. In other words, all the votes of Florida go to one candidate or the other. While Maine and Nebraska divide. And then each elector casts a vote for a presidential candidate, and the winner is the person with the largest number of electoral votes, as long as that's more than half. So Just as an example, I'm going to use a large state and a small state. California has 55 electors. It has 53 electors by population and 2 senators, so it gets 55. The small states, and there are 7, Alaska, Delaware, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Vermont, and Wyoming, have 3 electors because they have only 1 representative by population and 2 senators. So you can see that by population, California should have about 53 times the amount of influence over a small state, and it only has 18.3 times because it has 55 compared to 3. I'm just trying to show you the way that the Electoral College works to strengthen small states and cut down on the electoral advantage of big states, which, as we'll find out, is intentional, right or wrong. The original theory, this is going to totally boggle your mind, I think, it did mine, is the original theory is the voter votes for an individual elector. In each congressional district, people can put their names up as electors, and whoever gets the most vote in that congressional district becomes the elector. There is no party designation. Parties haven't been heard of yet. There's no presidential candidates. You are electing somebody who is going to then vote for president. This is an indirect election. And the electors meet on the first Monday after the second Wednesday of December. Don't ask me how that works out, but you know, that's when they actually meet in each state physically. And in theory, the original theory, they discuss who to vote for, and then they must vote for 2 presidential candidates. 1 must be out of state. And the assumption is, with these states spread out over there, always going to have a favorite. Yeah, I can see Carrie shaking her head. This is weird. This is weird. But they're going to vote for 2 candidates, and then write down the votes for that group, because there were 13 states, if you remember. So there could be either from 3 electors up to 10. The largest number of electoral votes was 8. So you're going to have those people write down their 2 candidates and send them to the Senate where they get opened. And then if there's a majority of the vote for 1 candidate, they're president, and the second highest total is vice president. This is the way it worked originally. It got messed up, by the way. But anyway, that was the indirect process, and it was actually done that way for the first 2 elections because the candidate was uncontroversial. His name was George Washington. But by the time you get to the start of the party system, then it all has problems. So the original theory in action worked fine in 1788 and 92 with George. But it broke down in 1796, because in 1796, John Adams of the Federalist Party defeated Thomas Jefferson of the Republican Party. That's not a misprint. Most historians call it the Democratic Republican Party because they know people will balk at the idea of Thomas Jefferson as this is an old designation. And due to the rules, Jefferson became the vice president. In other words, 2 people of opposite parties, the president and vice president of opposite parties. They did change that pretty soon. So if we compare this to 1 man, 1 vote, using a direct election as the standard, which is an assumption, then there are 2 sources of discrepancies. One is the small states get an advantage from having the 2 senators added in when electoral votes are given. And the winner-take-all causes a further discrepancy, as opposed to just splitting them evenly. Okay, purpose of the Electoral College. I say it is to preserve the balance of power among states and regions. And in 1787, the balance of power among states was about the big states versus the small states, because that was the big argument at the convention. And the balance of power among regions was about the North versus the South. And they neither party wanted to be outvoted by the other party. And this is going to get us into the topic, the ugly topic of slavery in just a second. But you can see that this directly affected, this balance of power directly affected the Electoral College. So here's the historical background. There was a Revolutionary War from 1776 to 83, and the Articles of Confederation that formed a very weak government, so there were problems with that. And I had somewhere, I didn't get this in, but George Washington at Valley Forge with troops that don't even have boots for their, or uniforms. And that's because the government was so weak it couldn't impose taxes. James Madison began his study of how to set up a better government in 1784. And there was an Annapolis Convention called under the Articles of Convention, under Articles of Confederation in September 1786, which failed to get off the ground because there were only 5 states that showed up. But James Madison and Alexander Hamilton used that convention to put out a call for a constitutional convention in May of 1987. And they really did not have authority to do that, but they did it, and everybody is happy about it. So there is Convention Hall, and that's what it looked like on the inside. There is the people there. Here are the original 13 colonies. Okay, we're just talking about the eastern seaboard, obviously, at the time. And there's a horse and buggy. This is how they had to travel. They're not getting in their cars or the train. There's George Washington, who presided at the Constitutional Convention. That's Mount Vernon. Here is James Madison, who I would call, and most people would, the master designer of the Constitution. And that's Montpelier. And there's Thomas Jefferson, who had drafted the Declaration of Independence, and he was ambassador to France at this time. But he was purchasing books in France, such as the famous Encyclopedia of Diderot, and sending them to James Madison at Madison's request. And that's Monticello. And there's Alexander Hamilton, a delegate from New York, who joined Madison and Jay in writing the Federalist, which is the official explanation when the Constitution was ratified about what it all meant. So there's the Constitution. What was the situation in 1787? We need to think our head into this because the Revolutionary War had just ended. There were no precedents for a democratic republican. There were no other ones around. And they had a very weak government under the Articles of Confederation, and they were under threat from foreign countries. Spain had Florida, France had the Louisiana Purchase, Britain had Canada to the north, and it also had troops in forts on American soil. They were supposed to get out of there, but the agreement was that the U.S. had to pay its debts to British merchants, and it wasn't doing that. So they still had troops up along the northern border. And there were Native Americans, because they had the French and Indian War not too long before. But the best example for a new nation was actually Britain, the very nation they had rebelled against. Britain's constitution was highly admired because it separated power in 3 branches: the executive, the legislative, and judicial. And separated the legislature into 2 houses, the House of Commons, House of Lords, had an independent judiciary. And its form of government was highly praised by Montesquieu. He's a Frenchman who said this is the best of all protections of freedom. And the problem, well, it was somebody named George III. And as you may remember, George III was taking power very aggressively in England and also starting to exercise a lot of power in the U.S. without any input from the U.S. And so in the eyes of the colonists, the Americans, it was not the British system that was at fault. It was a power grab by the king, King George III. And if you read the Declaration of Independence, you'll find it's not complaining about Great Britain. It's complaining about King George is doing this, he's doing that. It's like a list of 30, 40 things that he is invading our freedoms. And that was the reason for the American Revolutionary War. So anyway, King George, his previous actions raised major concerns about executive power, and so the process of choosing a president became very important. They wanted to avoid giving the president too much power, but they needed enough power to get things done. And they had lengthy discussions throughout the convention about how to do it, and the result, as we know, was the Electoral College method. Now, there was general knowledge among all the framers about ancient Greece and Rome. And Greek democracy had been threatened by demagogues, who won a vote and then started infringing on freedoms. Tyrants that became dictators. There was an Amphictyonic League of ancient Greece. When they start talking about this, I had to pull out my cell phone and say, I've heard of it, but I couldn't remember what. Anyway, there was a Roman Republic threatened by dictators, and Julius Caesar was probably the best known, and he got assassinated by defenders of the Republic. And then Caesar Augustus, who was Octavian, took over, and he never called himself a dictator. He was princeps, right? He was the first citizen. So, problems with other confederacies. This is Madison. He went through the whole history of the world and picked out every confederacy, because remember, this is the Articles of Confederation, and saw, the problems they had with the Lycian, the Helvetic, the Amphictyonic, the Achaean, the Germanic, the Belgic. I could tell you what these are, or maybe I couldn't. But each of them had the same problem, basically. They didn't have enough central authority, and therefore, like the Articles of Confederation, the states could do whatever they wanted. And if they asked for money, well, the states would say, well, maybe we'll send you a little. Madison's preparations, he ordered trunkloads of books from Thomas Jefferson and took notes. And he actually wrote up an essay, I have it right here, called the Notes from Previous Confederacies. Used examples from many eras, and then he wrote up a list of the vices of the Articles of Confederation, what was wrong with them. So he had actually 11 specific things that he could, off the top of his head, talk about. Wrote letters to allies, and drafted the Virginia Plan used by the convention. It's called the Virginia Plan. The governor of Virginia presented it, but everybody now knows who drafted the Virginia Plan, and it was James Madison. Okay, now what happened here? Okay, so the Philadelphia Convention had 55 framers from 12 of the 13 colonies. Rhode Island refused to participate because they smelled that this was going to get rid of their power in a very small state. They met for 4 months, May 14th to September 17th, and they met, I couldn't believe this, but they met 6 days a week for 4 solid months.
Wow.
There was one break, and that was when they were drafting the plan. And this is Madison's journals about that. He has 660 pages, every motion, who voted on it. And of course, it was a secret because it was total secrecy. The windows were nailed shut, so nobody could find out what was going on. And Madison, they had agreed to keep it secret. Madison would never publish it. It didn't get published till his death in 1840. He was the last person living of the original founders. So what we know about the purpose is mainly from that thing called the Federalist Papers, which were the series of articles written by Madison and Hamilton and John Jay to explain it to people so they would vote for it. And at this convention, the voting was always by state. You had to have 2 people present to have a vote, and then if they agreed, they voted. but if they disagreed, it wouldn't count because they were divided. And then if it was like 5 people, it'd be 3-2. Everything is by state. And there were 2 main issues, which is national power versus states' rights. That was always the big one, contentious, and it resulted eventually in something called the Grand Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. And the Grand Compromise is the House of Representatives totally by population and the Senate totally by state. And in fact, you may not know this, but the Senate was originally appointed. It wasn't elected. It was appointed by the state legislature of each state. So that went all the way until this century, well, about 100 years ago. The amendment was passed to make the Senate elective. And the other big issue throughout, and this was a search. This was not like 2 sides. They were really trying to figure out how to do the president, because they needed a strong leader, but they had a fear of a bully like our friend King George III. So there are 2 misunderstood issues, things that the framers got wrong, or at least didn't understand. They believed that slavery was declining and would eventually disappear. And even the Southerners there agreed with this. And that was obviously not true, very sadly. And they were totally unaware of a 2-party system since none existed. Even Britain had just the barest beginnings of a 2-party system. And slavery did seem to be declining. Slavery was legal in all 13 colonies in 1776. And in New York City, 42% of the families owned a slave. That's pretty surprising to me. By 1787, most of the northern states had ended slavery. And really because of the war was for freedom. And by 1787, the southern states had ended the African slave trade because they were moving in the same direction. Delegates to this convention thought it was going to decline, and when it came up about ending the slave trade, they had no problem agreeing to end the slave trade by 1808. Constitutional. So, unfortunately, there's something called the cotton gin, invented in 1793, 6 years later, which changed the economics of cotton completely, because that led to the planting of huge amounts of cotton in the U.S., the South, and there was the Industrial Revolution just starting in England, the spinning jenny and all that. They could spin huge amounts of cotton, and cotton was very desirable. Everybody loved it. I love it. You know, my shirts are cotton, my jeans are cotton, my underwear is cotton, my socks are cotton, my pajamas, you know, it's a wonderful, and this is what everybody thought. And so the fact they could use the cotton gin to produce a lot and use the spinning in England, in fact, by 1860, cotton was 61% of American exports. It was our main crop. And that had changed from almost nothing in 1787. So that was caused by the cotton gin. There's Eli Whitney. And probably never has a product that was so desirable to so many people been so horrendous to the people who had to work in the fields under conditions of slavery. So the impact of slavery on the Electoral College. 4 years before this convention, in 1783, under the Articles of Confederation, they tried to get more power in the Articles of Confederation. And the question that came up was taxation. How much each of the 13 colonies. And they had wanted to make it by proportion to population, but how do you count slaves, right? And on that one, the South said, no, we don't count anything for slaves, because it would be taxed. And slaves are property, was what they said. North wanted to count 100%, right? And the compromise was 3/5. They would count 3/5 of this ugly. And that was then vetoed by New York and New Hampshire, so remember, it requires unanimity in the articles. But they had had this discussion once. Now, in the Constitutional Convention, this time it was about power, right? How many representatives you're going to get. And this time the South wants 100% of the slaves counted, and the North wants 0% of them counted. And the compromise was 3/5. So, but it also meant that when it came to the subject of direct election, which is the topic we're talking about today, right? The South wouldn't do that because in a vote, they got, in terms of electoral votes, they got votes for 3/5 of the slaves, but the slaves couldn't vote in the presidential election. There's so much weirdness going on here, but that's the way it is. Okay, also the two-party system they didn't understand because it was completely ignored, it didn't exist. In England, there's just the very beginning of, if you know, the Rockingham Whigs and Edmund Burke and the Earl of Rockingham, just barely starting. And Madison hated parties, and most of them did. They called it factions. People gathered together for some purpose, and they wanted to split them up. So they couldn't, if you want to know why our government is so difficult to get things done on the federal level, it's because they wanted to split the states against the federal government into three parts, the three branches, the legislative branch into the House and the Senate, so they'd oppose each other. The president's elected in a different way, and the judiciary is there. And one of the reasons they loved the Electoral College was because instead of having people gather someplace where they could pull off some kind of a power grab, there were going to be 13 different meetings that were voting for president. So they were all, it was splitting up power. This was all about freedom and not allowing power. Now, of course, it's arguably quite different. So, purpose of the Electoral College, this is just restating, to preserve the balance of power among states and regions, and that was the big states versus small states, and the regions back then was the North versus the South. Now, in modern day terms, there's still regional issues, but we're going to get to that. Well, actually, here it is. This is the red state, blue state map from 2016. And now, while there's still an issue about power among states, because the difficulty in getting a constitutional amendment is states give up influence. But the regions now are the blue states versus the red states. And the way that works is this. It can be argued, I'm just giving you theory here, that the Democrats are afraid of the Republicans running up huge vote totals in the red states that would overbalance their blue states. And the Republicans are afraid that the Democrats would run up huge totals in California and the West Coast and the East Coast, and that would overbalance them. And what the Electoral College actually does, I can't say it was designed to do this, but it says you have to have a nationwide power base rather than a regional one. And remember that question was in 1787 about the North and South. Nobody wanted to be overpowered. The one time you really see this is in the 1860 election for Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln could have been defeated in a direct election because the South was totally against him. You know how many votes Lincoln got in the South? Anybody know? 0. I couldn't believe, how could he get 0 votes? The answer is they wouldn't put him on the ballot. All of these things are, I think, odd. But, okay. So there's the, I didn't show you that. This is the red state, blue state. Okay, alternatives. Now we get to what you really want to hear. What were the framers trying to do? That was the subject that we were talking about. And now we're talking about changing to direct election, meaning popular vote, in 2 ways. One is by amending the Constitution, And the other means is a new thing that's just come up, and it's called the National Political Vote Interstate Compact. And there's new information as of 9 days ago. And here, amending the Constitution requires a 2/3 vote in House and Senate, doesn't require presidential approval, but then the ratification has to be 3/4 of the states, that's 38 states. That's what makes it so difficult. And there we go. Now, the closest attempt to do that was 1969. Senator Birch by Emanuel Seller sponsored a bill. That was after George Wallace got 46 electoral votes in 1968. And that bill passed the House by 339 to 7. Richard Nixon, the president, endorsed it, but it was filibustered in the Senate and it couldn't get through. That plan, though, required a candidate to receive at least 40% of the popular vote to be elected. You know, I've been talking about a two-party system, but in fact, if you have 3 or 4 or more parties, then you have to worry about a runoff election. And their plan said, so you have 2 things. Is there going to be a runoff election? And some people who favor a direct election don't want a runoff, just give it to the one who gets the most votes, no matter what they are. And the normal plan here is a runoff election if the winning candidate gets less than 40%. I know that Bill Clinton won his first term, I think, by 41%. That's because Ross Perot was in that. Yeah, you learn a lot of things. And this plan was endorsed by the American Bar Association, and they had looked at a whole bunch of different options for amendment. Anyway, amendment is difficult because of the requirements for 38 states to ratify a plan that reduces the influence of the smaller states. And they have another difficulty because of the possible impact on the two-party system, because if you go to a direct election, it can be argued, I'm just giving you the arguments here, that then there's a real temptation for people to vote for splinter parties. You know, the Green Party or the pro-choice party, or on the other side, you know, the libertarian or the pro-life party, and knowing that they have a runoff election to go back to. But I'm only talking theory here. You can do with it what you want. But there are also reforms to the Electoral College that don't require amendment. And there's a number of proposals. A lot of people, these are all based on one fact, which, as you saw, the control of what the states do is entirely with the states. The states can decide to do anything they want. They would have to convince each other, but and the most significant one is called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, NPVIC. And that's a compact, it's an agreement among a group of U.S. states and the District of Columbia to award all their electoral votes to whichever presidential candidate wins the overall popular vote in the 50 states and D.C. And it comes into effect only if it would guarantee that outcome. So if you have enough states with 270 electoral votes that agree to this, you can do it without amending the Constitution. And right now, they have 12 states in the District of Columbia, and they have 181 votes, which is 67% of the 270 they need to give it legal force. And in fact, Connecticut just joined last year, 2018, and Colorado 9 days ago joined on March 15th of 2019. So that's...
in there? Is Pennsylvania in there? You know?
Let me, because I'm right at the end, and then I'm going to open this up for questions. And their argument, of course, is that all of the presidential candidates' campaigns get done, you know, 2/3 in just 6 states and 94% in 12 states. In other words, the other states are ignored. Of course, what would be the impact? Currently, presidential campaigns are focused on the swing states. One obvious impact, the campaigns would change to focus on the states in which they could run up large majorities. And the impact would be not so much to seek the middle ground, which is what the current system sort of forces them to be in the swing states. You can't get too radical, but you could be more partisan if it's in all the states. So that is, I'm sorry, this is just to say thank you. Okay. All right, come and ask me questions.
Because you mentioned that there was no model,
Yeah,
but he said that actually our Constitution turns out to be a cut and paste document of the state constitutions or the state documents. That it didn't actually come from someone's head, it actually came, the wording actually came from the state documents already, that already existed.
that's a very good point. What he's saying is that the states between 1776 and 1787 had all, they were colonies before. And so they all had to find their own form of government. And they all had two houses, two legislative houses, except one exception, which is Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania had a unicameral, a single house government, because Benjamin Franklin loved unicameral governments. And he had he was here, but he was at this convention. So yeah, they had a lot of experience. They had the governors. They had their own judiciaries. Now, it doesn't mean that experience was necessarily good. In fact, Pennsylvania was notorious, this is at the time, 1787, for having elections swing back and forth so wildly that the new government would change everything the old one did, and they were going back and forth. So one of the things that the founders wanted was some stability. But yeah, they did have all of those examples, and so there'd been a lot of discussion in the 13 colonies about forms of government. You're true, that's right. They did have the state models to look at. I have one story that I want to share, and this is, again, just sort of an oddity, but in the year 2000, October, Vice President Al Gore was fighting with Governor George W. Bush for the nomination. And in the last few weeks of the election, Gore and his strategists became pretty much convinced they were going to win. They were going to lose the popular vote to Bush, but win in the Electoral College. So they had to be, so Gore had his speechwriters draw up a speech defending the Electoral College. And Bush thought the same thing. So he had his people talking about how we was robbed because he won the popular vote. And as it turned out, it was 180 degrees, and both candidates went 180 degrees. Now, I don't know what lesson you should learn from it. But hopefully, when you think about this, I hope it's thought about in terms of principles that are involved rather than who won which election. I'm not going to convince anybody here of that after 2016, but it's a pious hope that I have.
What would be the argument for and against going that direction? I kind of, in simple terms, just, what's good about the popular vote and what's bad about the popular vote, as well as what's good and bad about the Electoral College.
Well, my opinion has been going back and forth. Okay. I think the thing that has impressed me the most, well, one, there's a whole thing about the two-party system, and would we be encouraging third and fourth and fifth parties, and how that plays out, because our system is not like the European systems, where you have, you could have a vote of confidence in the prime minister and then call elections. We have fixed term elections and a fixed term presidency. So I'm not sure how a multiple party thing would fit in. But really, the one that just struck me most strongly is the fact that, they're complaining about two-thirds of the presidential visits are in swing states, the 6 swing states. Well, that has the advantage of forcing everything into the center. Parties can't become radical because they have to carry the swing states. And now, if you want parties to become radical, then, the popular, but it would definitely change where the elections are contested from that to much more in the big states, with people going into the states favorable to them and trying to rev up that electorate. So that's not even a theoretical, that's just something for me to think about. But the real impact is going to be, where are the elections fought? Which states are they fought in? Well, it's hard for me to understand what the U.S. is doing too. Okay.